So, how to talk about homelessness and comparatively, is it as big of a problem as, those Project Manifesto shitbags make it sound like it is? And I was like, yeah, there's got to be a way to do this. And I started kind of racking my brain a little bit. And I started looking up the numbers. And then I started looking up empty apartments. Right? That makes sense, right? Homeless people versus empty apartments. Pretty self-explanatory. REITs, corporate America, own almost all the apartment complexes in the country. Period. There's a handful that are owned by cities and towns, but the mass majority of them are literally owned by corporate America, REITs. Okay? What stuck out in my mind when I started looking up these numbers was how low and minuscule the homelessness numbers actually are compared to the locations, the cities, populations. Like, I was like, what? You got millions and millions and millions of people in Chicago. And yet, you only have 6,139 homeless. These are 2023 numbers, end of 2023. But wow, you talk about empty apartments in Chicago. They have 128,704. Almost 130,000 empty apartments. They can't have 6,000 people. And keep in mind, a third of our homeless are children. So 4,000 households, 128,000 plus empty apartments. You can't come up with 4,000 apartments? Really? Atlanta, 2,679 homeless, 35,000 empty apartments. Miami, 3,600 plus homeless, 196,000 plus empty apartments. Yes, almost 200,000 empty apartments, and they can't house roughly what? 4,200 households? San Francisco, 7,582 homeless versus 66,000 apartments. Houston, 3,800 versus 89,000 empty apartments. Dallas, 4,200 homeless people, 81,000 empty apartments. New York, we will get back to New York because they are a unique animal and they're the only one that didn't follow the pattern that I'm telling you. Kansas City, 1,800 homeless with 6,300 plus empty apartments. Wichita, Kansas, 691 homeless with over 13,000 empty apartments. Now, don't get me started about how Wichita, Kansas has never recovered from comments made by a previous president, but I'm going to use this as my point, about our aircraft industry. Wichita had never experienced what they are still experiencing now, and they have not recovered. $13,000 empty apartments. Because they keep following that Project Manifesto leadership and electing those people and hurting themselves in the process. You only have 691 homeless, and those red Project Manifesto backed people decided to sell 352 city-owned apartments where they could have housed almost all of those people. Just last year, no joke. And meanwhile, there's over 13,000 privately owned apartments in all those apartment complexes across Wichita. standing empty. What was most interesting was there are a couple of exceptions where the homeless exceed the availability of apartments, but they're in growth regions like Greenville and Minneapolis. And it seems odd to me that either of these have become poster children because, of course, they've had where young men, and when I say young men, men in their 20s to 40s, go and attack homeless camps. And they've been in the news for that, which is weird because, Minneapolis is an extremely large city. It's not small by any means. I think it's about the level, if I remember correctly, it is about the level of an Atlanta or a Chicago. It's close. It's not quite all the way there, but it is huge. And it has 3,300 homeless people. And Greenville, South Carolina, the other that's been in the news for attacks on homeless, has about 3,200, which is weird because the overall population of Greenville versus Minneapolis, Greenville is much, much smaller. But what I found was interesting is both of these claim to be in a growth position. Greenville is adding about 5,000 new apartments every year, and they haven't been able to keep up with the growth. So there's only about, at any given time, they're reporting about 2,000 empty apartments at any time. And Minneapolis isn't reporting how many empty, they're just reporting that they're short and that they are adding about 14,000 new apartments every year for about the last 6 years. Yeah. So those are unique, and it might explain why the Project Manifesto bullhorn crazies would point to them in order to cause those attacks, because of course they are actually struggling with how fast they're growing. But the majority of the country is not in that position. As I said, every major city that they point to normally actually has way more empty apartments than they can handle. New York begins to highlight what the problem is with corporate America owning apartments and owning this and not being fair to people. Because obviously, if you have only Miami 3,600 homeless and you have almost 200,000 empty apartments, it's obvious that corporate America is writing off a lot of those apartments, right? It's just grossly obvious. It's absurd. But New York highlights the insidiousness of this issue, because New York has had for decades, I think almost a century now, what we call rent control apartments. And these are not necessarily owned by the city. New York City does own some. There are towns, even Wichita, as I explained, own their own apartments in order to help deal with their homeless and their low income that can't afford housing. But New York City has what we call rent-controlled apartments and non-rent controlled apartments that are privately owned. And New York City has 88,000 homeless after they've filled up all their own housing that they own. They still have 88,000 homeless. They have 61,000 apartments free that are owned by private entities. Of those, half of them are rent controlled, but they're standing empty. The other half, the mass majority of those, have come out of apartments that are rolling out of rent control. So the way that they prevent the rent control so they can drive up the rents is they leave them empty. And while they leave them empty, they are allowed to write off all of these empty apartments as a tax write-off, like they're doing with houses, the RAITs that don't give a shit. They've got a couple thousand empty houses in Houston or San Francisco or whatever and refuse to sell them or rent them, right? They do this in New York with these apartments because they don't want the rent control on that anymore. They want to be able to charge whatever they want to charge, even if it's astronomical and it doesn't fit the market, right? There wouldn't be any homeless people if the market is marketed right, period. Simple. Supply and demand. If free market, no one would be homeless if you have 20,000 people would be homeless. If you have 61,000 empty apartments and 80,000 looking for homes. Now, again, if we go into that whole, a third of them are children, now you only need 60,000, you got 61,000. But these corporations write off the empty apartments on their taxes as net losses. They literally are creating the homeless problem. It's an easy solve. These people should be following free market, right? They're not. They don't care about those minuscule numbers of homeless. They use it as a dog whistle so that they can continue to get their tax breaks. That's it. It's that simple. It's obnoxious, it's toxic, but it's that simple. And as far as the Project Manifesto people, all of their candidates, little yipe dogs about how the homeless are taking over our country. Well, obviously they're not. I've given you the numbers. They're not taking over the country, though. The homeless is a minuscule problem. I've talked about how some of you are hanging by a thread or a yarn, maybe a couple yarns, but it's minuscule. In fact, it's so minuscule, homelessness is not even mentioned in the Project Manifesto. For people that have caused, with their barking and their bullshit, attacks on actual homeless people, they don't even put it in the manifesto, boys and girls. It means nothing to them. It's all bullshit. And every city in this country, except New York, can house their homeless with the amount of empty apartments. Every single one. Think about it. Vote better.